Volunteering abroad destroys communities when it's done wrong. In this video, I'm going to be going over how naive people who volunteer overseas wreck the communities that they're looking to help, and how with one mindset shift, you can do better work than 99% of people. And just so you know, this video is going over my favorite lessons from an amazing book called Service Learning. Highly recommend you check it out when you can. So you're probably wondering, how can volunteering hurt people? That's like saying donating money to charity is evil. And this naive assumption is a huge part of the problem. When we assume that everyone out there has the best of intentions, we blind ourselves to the reality of what the world actually looks like, and we end up feeding into systems that hurt people. I'll give you an example. Let's say you find a placement to teach English at an orphanage in Nambia. You're really excited about the opportunity. You love kids, you're considering getting into teaching, and you have this huge travel bug, so you're excited to see the world, so you decide to sign up. When you get there, you find the job really challenging and really rewarding. You'd never taught before, so you're happy to learn very quickly on your feet. You really enjoy spending time with the kids between classes. You take photos together on your smartphone, you play soccer, and all in all, it's an amazing positive experience, and you can't wait to get home and tell your friends and family about it. Now, what I'm about to say is gonna sound crazy, and it blew my mind when I first read about it. Let's say you're at the airport about to go home and you stumble on the book Learning Service, and you read this about these orphanages overseas. It turns out all the orphans you were teaching had families, and they'd either been stolen from their family or been sold to the orphanage with the promise of a better life. It turns out that all these orphans you were helping were kept in bad conditions on purpose, because if they looked, very clean, and if all the kids look very well fed and the orphanage beautiful, then the orphan, like the people running the facility, they would get no money from Westerners looking for help. So instead they keep the kids in poor conditions and pocket the money themselves. The kids don't care about their local language anymore. All their teachers have been these Western people who know English, and they're all very wealthy and well-traveled, so they want to learn English. They want to be like these cool people who showed up to their village. The kids that you came to love are shaken, because every 4 months the teachers that they too came to love abandon them, and they're not sure why, and they feel like it's their fault that they're leaving. And the kids themselves are falling behind on their education because you were learning how to teach for those first 2 or 3 months, and they could have been way further ahead had like a trained teacher been teaching them. You spent 4 months volunteering in Nambia, and what has your help accomplished? You've enabled a system that strips kids of their family, of their language, and of their self-esteem, while enriching some guy to continue doing this. Also, you can tell yourself and tell your friends and family that you're making the world a better place. So volunteering abroad is a waste of time? Yes, it is, unless you know this one mindset shift that's taught by the authors of Learning Service. The volunteerism industry has a branding problem. They're not sure what to call the experiences they send Western people on. For years, they call them international volunteering programs, but that creates 2 problems. The first is it creates saviorism. It makes you, the Westerner who's traveling overseas, the hero who's giving up their time and their money to cure the world of its problems just by showing up. But the reality is the problems of the world are much more complicated than we realize. And 2, it creates this assumption that I was really guilty of when looking at these programs from afar, is it makes people wonder, like, why am I paying to volunteer abroad? Aren't I giving up my time after all? And people who think this way, they're ignorant of how much goes into even the hosting a volunteer in another country. And they also forget the fact of just how much you yourself are learning when you get to join one of these communities and be a part of the communities. It's a two-way street. You're not the only person getting something out of this. So conscious companies have moved towards calling their programs service learning programs. And this is an awesome upgrade because it gets away from like the virtuous tone around the word volunteering, as well as making this sound like a two-way street. Yes, you're serving, that's awesome, thank you. But also you're learning along the way. You're getting something out of this experience. Now this wording causes a different issue. When you make learning secondary to service, it makes it sound like you learn stuff during and after you volunteered. Now this creates some problems. Number 1, everyone who volunteers abroad learns the same lesson, that their time wasn't as well spent as it could have been. 2, you learn that problem that you were looking to put an end to when you showed up is going to continue long after you left. And 3, you learn that your time there might have actually caused more harm than good, leaving you feel very icky and guilty about that time, those months that you spent abroad. The solution sounds simple, but it has a huge impact. The authors propose that we flip these words around and instead call it learning service. When you volunteer overseas, you're not volunteering in a vacuum. You're stepping into a system that's been around for decades and will continue to exist well after you leave. Any outsider stepping into the system, both organizations and volunteers, can't know everything. It's too complicated. And if there was a quick fix, the locals would have done it already. For this reason, we have to learn in order to serve effectively. So what does that look like? Organizations that choose the learning service approach look to address the root causes of an issue. It's the difference between, giving out shoes to people who need shoes versus helping that community build up their economy so they themselves can just buy their own shoes. These organizations promote locals inside of their ranks and allow them to drive change, because ideally, the organization will one day step outside of the community and the community has to continue working on their own. They can't be dependent on these nonprofits and NGOs that help them. All volunteers that show up in these communities are thoroughly vetted. They don't bring volunteers in just to get a little bit of cash out of them and give them menial work. No. They want people to show up and actually make an impact in the communities that they're looking to help. The volunteers that do show up are given supporting roles. They're not given massive leadership roles inside the community because, again, these volunteers are going to leave. This community is going to continue existing. And we don't need the community leaning on these temporary people that come and go. The organization looks to build up the community to stand on its own. Now, this one's huge. The language they use in their marketing talks about strengthening a beautiful community full of interesting people, not of saving desperate people who are helpless without you. Volunteers following a learning service approach are going to seek out organizations like what I just described. Before they go to the community that they're going to be helping, they're going to learn everything they can about the history of the area. They're going to learn about the culture. They're going to take the time to learn about current events and politics happening in the region. And above all else, this is the number one thing, they're going to take the time to learn the language of the local people so you can meet them where they're at versus asking them to speak to you in English. Now, aside from learning the language, the next most important thing is to approach your time abroad with a learning mindset. These people are going to live completely different lives than you. The pace of life is going to be different. The way they communicate with each other is going to be different. The way they dress is going to be different. And you are a guest in their community. This is the way they approach it. You're not going to complain about how things are different. You're not going to openly talk about how things are better back home. Instead, you're going to adapt and follow along with the way of life that is in the community. You're a guest there, so you should act like a guest there and treat them with respect. Now, Learning Service is an amazing book for people who are looking into volunteering overseas. And if that's you, I 10 out of 10 recommend that you read it cover to cover. I did my best to cover my favorite lessons from the book, but there's still a lot of juice in there that you can squeeze out. Now, this video and this book are entirely useless to you if you can't afford to travel. Check out this video for one really good idea on how to earn some cash so you can fund your travels.